Hi, my name is Eva Steiner and this is my project Psychotherapists Around the Globe. I am interviewing the psychotherapists around the world and asking them the same 8 questions. I am wondering how mental health profession is in their country. Today we are going to... Thank you for doing this interview with me. Before we start, can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Yes, of course, and thank you for the invite. I think it's really kind of an inspired and inspiring initiative. So my name is Ivana Mergen. I'm a clinical psychologist and psychotherapist coming from Croatia, currently living in Qatar for the last 7 years.
So tell me a little bit about your culture. What is some holiday or tradition that your country celebrate? And if your culture would be an emotion, what emotion would it be?
Our history is layered and political situation complex. Preparing for that, also prompted my thinking and to kind of a self-reflect because currently I'm a completely different cultural context looking in and sometimes it brings a bit of a interesting perspective. I would say that bordering with 5 countries, being part of the continental Europe but also part of the Mediterranean, is also kind of a showing up to this complexity of different cultural influences. So there's this part of the kind of a Slavic culture and continuity of that, but also Mediterranean culture that is linked, with the kind of with the food, with family gatherings, and being close to family being seen as a really big value here. Upbringing, kind of a religious values that are like most of the people in Croatia are Roman Catholics, for example. So Christmas, Easter are big holidays with us. Maybe also kind of like part of the heritage of socialist days is also we're very big on Labor Day. So we would spending outside, doing barbecue with family and friends. Last is kind of linked with historical markdowns, kind of Independence Day, Statehood Day, and things like that. But umbrella would be like spending time with family and celebrating that. Definitely, there's a sense of importance of sports efforts and proudness, and being very proud of this legacy. What is also maybe important to say, and it's also part of my experience. The amount of Croatian people outside of Croatia are comparable to the numbers that are currently in. So we have a really big diaspora. Yeah, looking back, because we're obviously country of a lot of opposites. So when I was thinking about, there's national pride, but there's also a bit of a disillusionment. Economical, social situation is not the greatest. I would say and describe us as like energetic, but also apathetic at times. So we're kind of maybe slower to react, to change our position. And I presume that it's also linked with, complexity in terms of geographical position and historical background.
And what do you think is causing so many Croatian moving out?
I would say, starting from Second World War, that was something that was kind of a very typical in our parts to do. Also, socio-economical situation. Even after we entered in the Eurozone, so that was, 2013, relative expenses and salaries are not balanced out. So if you're kind of interested in better quality of life, a lot of people, were interested in living or trying out the expat life abroad. And again, as we have a really big diaspora, moving away and joining family and friends is much easier. So when these cycles are socially already started, it's kind of easier to move out if you have somebody that will kind of be living with you in, let's say, Hamburg or Sydney. There's a lot of parts where we have a really big diaspora community. That's basically what kind of motivates people. Now maybe entering Eurozone, it's more focused on Europe. Before, it was also transatlantic.
How did you become a psychotherapist in your country and what is your therapeutic approach?
So it was less regulated a few years ago. Now we have a chamber of psychotherapy. Before we had only chamber of psychology. So we now have both, and you can qualify as psychotherapist as a separate qualification, and then as well as psychologist. But to be a psychotherapist, you don't obviously need to be a psychologist. The procedure is like you need to finalize your faculty, you need to finish, accredited programs either in Croatia or umbrella associations in Europe. If you're not from a helping qualifications, let's say, or programs on the faculty, there's a kind of a preparation in terms of propedeutics of psychotherapy. So there's a course that you would take before you enroll in psychotherapy training. And obviously you need to have a police clearance certificate, especially if you're working with children and adolescents. So there's no kind of a liability in that sense. My personal kind of background is linked with CBT. So I started my training in 2011. I'm licensed CBT therapist through 2016, and then I moved out. Probably me choosing complementary therapeutical approach. I was motivated, with the type of clients that I was seeing. So it was more stress-related difficulties and more interpersonal trauma. So I'm now licensed in both CBT and schema therapy. Yeah, you even had my supervisor on. She was representative of Serbia. So yeah, that's my story.
And in Croatia, is there any law for psychology and psychotherapy?
Yes, so they are both. I would say law on linked with Chamber of Psychology and Psychotherapy. Then you have a specific law linked with psychological practice and psychotherapy practice that regulates your status. And there's also a registry of formally announced like psychotherapists that you can find in the Republic of Croatia.
The third question, how society looks upon psychotherapy or any psychological help?
It's an interesting question, and kind of reflecting back to that, I think it's also linked with the cultural heritage. Moving out, you kind of tend to reflect on your own countries and values and social standards. And it seems to me because we're described frequently in terms of some culture that dimensions that we uphold as not too prone to risk, so kind of risk averse, uncertainty avoidant, more focused in a kind of on structure and hierarchy, quite collectivistic society as well. And I think it also shapes the way you perceive authority figures. Beforehand it was like there's a doctor, there's a priest in your village, let's say, and they're like the general authority. So I think, for example, doctors, psychiatrists, you would expect them to kind of be very authoritative, very prescriptive, offer advice, very characteristic steps to kind of follow up and prompt you to follow the guidelines. And as currently, kind of a culture of mental health is more hospital based, if it makes sense. So it's more kind of psychiatric care than community care that is accessible. A lot of people still perceive mental health under that specific umbrella. So they would expect, for you to be maybe a bit more directive, more prescriptive. But there's some changes, related to the latest stressors, global stressor, I would say, with the war in Ukraine. We also had an earthquake, and there's also, COVID epidemic that kind of brought more awareness to the current issues. So more people are kind of asking for help. But what kind of makes it difficult is, again, the discrepancy with life expenses and salaries. So, for example, if you're not hospitalized, if you're not in psychiatric care, private pay services are usually expensive for people. So there's a gap there, if it makes sense. And revolving door. I was reading lately that kind of a hospitalization that will be referred from the ER, for example, linked with mental health. 80% of them were, indicated at the ER. Which would mean they weren't recognized before. There's no primary and secondary prevention. It's when it's very grave, you would get support. But a couple of years back, it started to change. And I would hope these kind of global movements, would continue.
Can you tell me more about how help is accessible in a sense of private care and public care?
So it changed a bit in the last 2 years, I would say, but predominantly it was hospital based, not community mental health based. So you have private practices and clinics, and there are now more and more of them, or kind of hospitals with psychiatric departments dedicated to specific, let's say, groups, substance abuse, let's say, children and adolescents, and things like that. Lately there's a kind of a community mental health centers that are now more equipped, so more psychologists, psychotherapists are working there, but it's still low in accessibility. I was reading that we have 8 psychologists in general kind of primary healthcare on 100,000 people, in comparison to the, let's say, Denmark that has 50 of them, so 6 times more. So I think there's a kind of a good progress there, but it needs to kind of keep up with the, kind of current initiatives. And definitely community mental health care is the way to go, because you want to kind of act preventively and support people when they're struggling, not when it's already acute.
And what was or still is some mental health stigma?
It's probably linked with, economical and social situation and the state of the healthcare in Croatia. But the idea is like having mental illness equals psychiatry, because there's no buffer zone. There's no kind of a community mental health. There's not kind of a soft interventions. It's like you're healthy or you're not, or you're hospitalized. So I think there's awareness around that. And that's the heritage that we kind of have from the maybe older generations. But it all started to kind of shift and change. But let's say epidemic, where people are getting more aware, and because it was a global, everybody suffered. So it was more socially acceptable to be open about suffering from something, especially during the earthquake that happened, because it is a kind of a socially acceptable reason to feel anxious. So it kind of reduced the stigma there. And the more people talked, exchanged their difficulties, or prompting others to receive help, that kind of dissipated a bit this kind of attention that, mental health is something serious and you're either healthy or you're not. There's nothing in between.
What is your society teaching about child-parent relationship, and whether this value of society also influence how you design your interventions as a therapist?
Listening to colleagues in the neighborhood, I notice some parallels, and it's only normal, minding the historical background and heritage and war that we had, in these parts. And the idea is, parents were busy. In the same time, maybe role as a parent was saturated to some extent because you were kind of busy or involved with other rules more, in terms of survival. If somebody is, kind of caring for children when somebody's away in war, for example, or such, that kind of complicates the care. So you would more like, you need to behave, you need to be responsible. So a lot of, I would say, parentified children all around, kind of that were children at that age. And those generations are now starting to be parents, or our parents already. So there was this idea that like you need to cater to community, not to be a nuisance. You need to know your place and things need to be nice and tidy. I think it kind of also created an echo effect even now, because a lot of Croatians are living with their parents still. So Croatia is one of the countries in the UE with the biggest percentage of people that are kind of young adults between 25 and 29 that still live with their parents. So that would mean the upbringing and the standards, they kind of form and shape your identity in continuity, because it's very then difficult economically and socially to gain independence. So I would say, a lot of my interventions, because there's a frequent case for clients that I work, from Croatia, is this kind of enmeshment. Like family postulates the values, the standards, the upbringing. So you need to be responsive, emotionally accessible all the time. And there's a lot of kind of underlying covert or overt guilt, where the idea is like you need to produce as a child something, find work, get married, have kids. So there's this kind of a checkbox that frequently people feel like they need to fill in. And if you have more kind of an alternative lifestyle or other values, there's a lot of clashes. So trying to discern what is mine, what is culture, what is my family, or where I want to sit with it, and where to kind of sit comfortably with myself, and what I want to be, navigating that and kind of making sure to, facilitate that process, alleviate the guilt, offer support, and kind of a reparenting a bit to some extent, and prompting this independence. I would say that's the a common aspect of my interventions, when I experience that kind of stories, and they're frequent.
And what is parental expectation from adult child?
As I said, to kind of to occupy the space of this kind of a life roles, being a parent, being independent, and being accessible. So kind of a cater to your older ones, show respect, include them in decisions that you're making. There's a running joke not only in my family, but in general, in terms of, kind of different types of upbringing that then would kind of clash. If your parents would kind of watch over the little one, what you tell them to do, what they do instead, and things like that. A lot of my clients and friends would kind of reflect on that as well, that there's tensions that kind of started in the childhood and how you relate with your parent, that they kind of find their way back when you enter in the role of being a parent.
So to me, it sounds like parents are pretty dominant in your culture, in a sense, like even as an adult, you are there for them. Am I getting the wrong impression?
No, and obviously it's a continuum. It doesn't mean that it's one-on-one. But I would say this kind of historical background, socioeconomical situation, and our history, relevance of religious upbringing that is kind of still quite relevant, kind of shapes that. I wouldn't say that it's there in totality, but definitely there are some risk factors that would then kind of make it more so. This kind of a Mediterranean, like hot-tempered, family is important, you need to be there for family, and yeah. So there's expectations around that.
Two more questions. One is regarding how are children viewed in your culture?
I was thinking about it a lot, and there's something that I frequently hear when I'm back home, and that is like, look what you did to me. Yeah. If you get dirty, if you take a chocolate bar, in the shop. So you're in a algorithm of being responsible how your parents feel and how they're perceived. So your job is to be nice and tidy and obedient, it seems to me. So sometimes I still see that. So I think probably because there's no healthy boundaries, it was, behaving or being guilt tripped or having no boundaries. So you didn't have a healthy middle in terms of like how to negotiate, how to recognize the needs, how to be responsive to the needs. So now people are kind of, it seems to me, sometimes sliding into the opposite direction of confusing, not having participatory parenting style, but having very permissive style from the, let's say, my colleagues that work with children and adolescents, that they sometimes struggle with parents more and navigating, relationship from their side more than they do with kids. Yeah.
Can you tell me more about this nice and tidy and behaving?
You should behave and kind of do everything that is expected of you without questioning. So there's this aura of because I said so, but that is maybe linked more with how it looked like when I was a child. Yeah, so kind of during the war, post-war era, because as I said, it was kind of more challenging for adults to navigate that phase. So it seems kind of natural that you kind of need to be more structured because there's no autopilot. Everyday life was very stressful. So your role as a child was to kind of to fit into this puzzle. So it was kind of then less reflective of developmental and biological needs of the chronology and being a kid or being adolescent.
And the second question, with these family dynamics, how it is in case of the abuse?
Before, if it makes sense, maybe it was more linked not with direct violence, but more with maybe neglect, I would say. Not general neglect, but neglect of developmental phases. And then kind of not being responsive to the needs. Also accept, kind of anxiety and depressive disorders. There is also high prevalence of substance abuse, for example. So I feel maybe lack of kind of a warmth, and I would say the situation is now better than before. And as I said, lately it seems that it's more on the side of like not providing healthy boundaries and context to develop is maybe more of a thing, which is again a form of neglect.
What are the learned beliefs regarding client-therapist relationship, and can the relationship continue outside the therapy once the therapy process is over?
In terms of the ethical guidelines, this is not well received. So the idea is, after we finish the therapy, that would be that. And obviously to disclose to your supervisor if it's happening, if you have any kind of difficulties, to consult with your colleagues, and then to find suitable response. If there's any difficulties or tensions, you also have availability of a lawyer, that you can kind of ask for an advice as a part of the services linked with the psychotherapist being a formal status. So I would say it's more firm no, but I know for the fact for colleagues that are from kind of small cities, when you're one provider that kind of works in a hospital, has a private practice, you would bump on each other and your kind of life roles would overlap. So I think it's much more difficult for people living in smaller places in Croatia than in big cities. But in general, yeah, the idea is like you shouldn't be involving in any other activities or developing friendships after the fact. But it also, I would say, discerns depending on the school of thought in terms of different modalities. Gestalt is a very strong kind of a modality. That would be kind of in my understanding, it's not so strict and reductive, but let's say in CBT school of thought, it's mostly like once when the relationship is done, you shouldn't be meddling with any other friendships or relationships.
In case of therapeutic abuse, so the therapist is the one that is abusive, approaching romantically the client or trying to build a friendship. Where can a client turn to, or what happens in that case?
Yes, and similar is true for both like a Chamber of Psychology and Chamber of Psychotherapy. They both on their websites, they have a kind of a clear procedure described. If there's any, kind of a difficult ethical or otherwise, transgressions. So you can kind of report your therapist if need be. If we, as colleagues, so first line of defense is if you notice something to kind of call them out and to discuss with them and try to manage the situation. If they're not responding or not changing their behaviors, the next step would then be to also to approach. And you have a responsibility as a psychologist or psychotherapist to do that.
Okay, the sixth question, is supervision a must for a therapist in your country?
Yes, individual psychotherapy, not so much. And again, it depends on the modalities when you're in training. Some would expect, some not. But supervision is mandatory. And even when you kind of would try and renew your licensing, for example, after 6 years, I needed to renew my license in CBT. And this was one of the legal requirements, formal requirements that you need to fill out in order to get licensed again. After the training, people are maybe less consistent with it, but there are numerous like intervention groups, peer support groups as well that obviously they don't have the same effect and the same outcomes, but are kind of like a supportive environment for that as well.
What are the most common complaints that the client comes to therapy for?
Yeah, I would say that it's similar as to global movements, depressive difficulties, anxieties and anxiety-related disorders, and substance abuse as well. And the combination of the three, these are the most frequent ones. And in terms of hospitalization in Croatia, it's also, higher percentage of people being hospitalized is either, kind of acute suicidality or substance abuse crisis or schizophrenia. So these three are most common ones that you get kind of hospitalized after the ER admittance.
And in your experience working as an expert, can you tell me a little bit more of what you see, maybe not specifically for Croatia, but like in general in your work?
Again, it's also kind of the body of knowledge is increasing because now we're more of a global society and a lot of people are either, working remotely, living remotely, or kind of live interculturally more. And the idea is, there's some indications that expat groups and ATCKs in particular, so that would mean adult third culture kids, that there's a kind of a higher incidence of mental health difficulties and specifically linked with stress-related disorders, either adjustment, interpersonal difficulties, maybe not being diagnosed, and changing and shifting lanes, changing countries, and then some of the things get kind of chronified. Expats are a bit more in risk than the general population, I would say. But again, most of the research is linked with US citizens, but I would say that it's comparable with other people as well. Also, that specific dynamic is very difficult on the family. It's a higher incidence of interpersonal trauma as well, and it's frequent chronified because with lots of moving and this sense of ambiguity of identity, it's kind of more pervasive, and especially if not attended to in an informed and educated manner in terms of trauma-informed approaches. So that's what I experienced. That was also part of my motivation why getting educated, trained, and licensed in schema therapy as well, because it seemed like a good complementary approach, because I saw and encountered more difficult presentation more people suffering, with layers. When on top of that can be some anxiety or something that linked with adjustment. When, after, the first doors, the trauma jumps. So being able to kind of leverage, balance, explore the needs, plan accordingly, knowing, that it's also somewhere in the background possibly, and to gently explore if somebody needs to tend to this as well, was of great help. And specifically, it's for me very interesting, and I'm really keen on that, is this idea of children that developed and lived in different places in their normative years, because their sense of identity and who am I and what is my culture is much more diverse and layered and complex to navigate than maybe somebody that kind of was living, continuously through all of their formative years in their home country. There is very big challenge, but also big opportunity to be sensitive and open and to tend to that.
If you would share one tool, belief, or approach that is a must-have for you as a therapist, what would that be?
It's probably colored by my experience, in my background, but I would say being culturally sensitive. One portion of that is being aware of your cultural baggage and not to be ethnocentric, not to kind of perceive everything from the filter of your own culture. Obviously, it is difficult not to do so, but being aware, being curious, exploring with the client, like that's what I heard, like how it was sent, like what I understood, how it affected you, because how something would affect me in Croatia is different than how somebody would be affected in the Philippines or Canada. So that's a really big thing that kind of started to be a part of my practice. And basing on the presentations and difficulties that have my Croatian clients have, I think managing ruptures and sending the picture that it's not the end of the world, and that kind of the responsibility is also on me, and then to kind of how to renegotiate and offer a safety net and safe surrounding for them to be more open. So I would say, being kind of gentle and very nuanced around building up this alliance and rapport, especially because there's a really big amount, and just my assessment, but I would say that reflects experience of my colleagues as well, a lot of parent-to-file children. So that would mean, responsibility, guilt, and themes linked with that are very prevalent. So being very cautious and gentle with that.